My name is Lauren Marlowe. I'm 32 years old, and I run my own investment firm in Chicago. For years, though, none of that seemed to matter to my family. To them, I was still the daughter who walked away, the sister who failed the shadow behind Mark's so-called brilliance. It all came to the surface on an ordinary Tuesday when my phone rang. The wedding planner's voice was sweet at first, then sharpened like glass. By your family's orders, you are uninvited from your sister's wedding. I froze, pen still in my hand, then laughed out loud because she had no idea who she was speaking to. The place my sister had chosen for her grand celebration, Grandview Manor, was mine. I had bought it months ago in silence. That moment was the spark, and from there, the night turned into something none of them expected. And if you think the shock ended there, wait until you hear what happened when the calls kept coming. For 3 years, the Henderson name followed me like a shadow, even here above Chicago's skyline. I stood at the window of my office on the 30th floor and let the city lights rise beneath me. From this height, the streets looked like veins of fire trains sliding through the dark sirens, faint in the distance. My desk behind me was neat papers, stacked, notes, circled figures, checked twice. I built order into everything I touched, because order reminded me I could hold something steady when so much of my past had been left to chaos. Yet, no matter how many projects I signed, no matter how many properties bore my name, Henderson was always there, just under the surface. A line in the report I held about a new development made my chest tighten. It pulled me back to a night I had tried to forget, a night at Henderson Financial when I was still their quiet daughter, working longer hours than anyone asked. I remember the small, glass conference room, the cold coffee I never had time to drink, and the numbers that kept me awake. I had built a bond deal piece by piece, cautious and exact. Mark walked in with his easy smile, picked up my folder, and said he would brief the board. Our father was already in the hallway, ready to clap him on the back. I sat there and watched through the glass as my brother presented my work as if it had been born in his hands. When it was over, praise rained on him. No one even looked at me. I gathered my papers and slipped out. The night air was sharp, and I told myself the numbers were enough. But there is a weariness that grows when your work is invisible, and that weariness had already begun to live in me. On my desk sat a picture frame I rarely touched. In it, a girl with hair brushed too smooth and a wide smile sat at the dinner table with a plate of peas. That girl was me. I remember the night the picture was taken. I had just told my father about a science project, a shoebox and a flashlight that made stars on the ceiling. My words hung in the air. Then he turned to Mark and asked about his summer plans. Erin was praised for her charm, as she always was. My mother passed me the peas and patted my hand without meeting my eyes. I pushed the food around the plate and learned what it felt like to be present, but unseen. People say children forget these small things, but they do not. The silence of that table has followed me every day since. I blinked back into the present and found my palm pressed against the cool glass of the window. This room was mine, my office, my company, my work. No one could take that away. And still, somewhere inside, I wanted one simple thing: to be recognized without condition. A knock at the door pulled me back. Daniel stepped in calm and steady, carrying a folder. He reminded me of the next call I had scheduled, respectful as always. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt in my ability to lead. That kind of respect was quiet, but it meant more to me than all the hollow praise my family had once given to Mark. I thanked him, and he gave a small nod, understanding that gratitude from me was not given lightly. When he left, I sat for a long moment in the stillness. The city glowed against the glass, endless and alive. I whispered the words softly to myself more than to anyone else. One day, they will see me. It was not anger. It was not revenge. It was a promise born from years of silence and a present I refused to give up. I turned back to my desk, underlined a name on a page, and steadied my breath. For now, the work in front of me was enough. Tomorrow, the storm would come. I had barely placed the file back on my desk when the phone buzzed, the kind of buzz that cuts straight through a quiet room. The number was unknown. I hesitated, then answered. A woman's voice came polished and sweet at first. She introduced herself as Vanessa, the planner for the Henderson wedding. My chest tightened the moment I heard that name. Before I could ask why she was calling, her tone shifted. She said she had been asked to inform me that I was not welcome at the wedding. The family's orders. For a moment, I could not move. The pen slipped from my fingers and rolled across the desk. The word, uninvited, echoed in my ears. I thought of Erin, my younger sister, the little girl who once ran barefoot in the yard behind our house, and now she had decided I was a shame too heavy to carry into her new life. Vanessa's voice pressed on, saying she was sorry, that it would be easier if I understood without protest. I steadied my breathing. I placed the pen down with care, as if that small act could anchor me, and I said only this. I understand. There was relief in her tone as she said goodbye. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the sound of my own heartbeat and the faint hum of the lights above. I sat back, eyes on the skyline, and let the old hurt rise. It was the same hurt I had felt as a child when my voice was ignored at the table, the same hurt I had carried home after long nights at the family firm, while my brother stood in the light of my work. Uninvited. A single word, but it held every dismissal, every silence, every moment I was told, without words, that I did not matter. My throat tightened, but no tears came. I had learned too well how to bury them. The office felt larger than usual, every surface echoing back the truth that my own family wanted me erased from a day that was meant to be about union and love. I sat in that silence until a knock broke through. Daniel stepped in holding a folder. He looked calm, as always, steady in a way that reminded me the world outside of my family was different. He said my 3 o'clock had been cancelled, but he thought I might want to review the Grandview files. He set the folder on the desk, not noticing the way my hand trembled as I reached for it. I nodded, thanked him softly. His eyes met mine for a second, respectful, loyal, without pity. That steadied me more than anything else could. When he left, I opened the folder. Inside were the details of Grandview Manor, the wedding venue I had purchased months ago. The pages listed bookings, revenue, maintenance schedules, small notes about the rose garden and the ballroom. I let my fingers trace the numbers. Uninvited, they said, but the truth was the entire place already belonged to me. I closed the folder and rested my palm on it. The pain was still there, sharp and deep, but beneath it another feeling stirred. Not anger that burned out quickly, but something colder and steadier, a choice. I would not scream. I would not beg. I would act. I pressed the intercom and told Daniel to cancel the rest of my meetings for the day. My voice was level, almost calm, but inside me the storm had already shifted course. I sat alone again, the phone quiet now, and a laugh slipped out of me, sharp and unguarded. They had cast me out once more, and they believed I would simply vanish. But the ground had already begun to move beneath their feet. I leaned back in my chair, eyes on the city, and whispered almost to myself, uninvited. That is what they think. The storm was here, and this time it would not be mine to endure. It would be theirs. The thought had barely settled when the phone lit my desk again, the same unknown number, the same buzz that cuts through a quiet room, and this time I picked up on the first ring. Vanessa's voice rushed out, polished edges, gone breath a little high, as she said she hoped she had not caught me at a bad time, then stumbled over herself to say she was sorry for the call. Before that, she had not meant to upset me. I let her finish, then spoke slowly, so each word would land where I wanted it to land. You can fix one thing for me, I said. Call my sister and tell her the venue has been double booked. The line went silent, and I could hear only the faint hiss of the connection and her unsteady breath. Double booked, she repeated, as if trying to test the words for danger. I kept my tone even. Yes, tell Erin there has been an error, and that your team will be in touch with alternatives. Her voice came back in a small rush, saying there was no way to move a wedding of this size on such short notice, that the Ashworth family would never accept it, that this would be a disaster, and I let her run until she ran out of air. Then I said the thing that would change the shape of the day. That will not be necessary, Vanessa, because I own the entire venue. I heard nothing for a beat, then the soft thud of a chair and her whisper, "You own it," followed by a thin sound that might have been a laugh or a gasp. I gave her the name she could look up in the records and the month the papers were signed. The calm in my voice surprised even me. She apologized again, almost tripping over the words, and asked if we could talk in person, if there was anything she could do to make this right. Call my sister, I said. Tell her there has been a change she should hear from me. And then I ended the call, not unkindly, but without apology. The phone rang again before I could set it down. Erin's name filled the screen, familiar and far away, and when I answered, she came straight at me, her voice tight, asking what kind of game I thought I was playing, saying I had no right to do this. It is not a game, I said, and I kept my breath steady. Check the property records. Marlowe Holdings purchased Grandview Manor 6 months ago. There was a long pause, the too quiet kind that means someone is searching for a way to deny what they already know is true. That is impossible, she said softer now, and I could hear hurt beneath the anger, the kind that comes when the floor moves under your feet. I told her I would not cancel her wedding, that I did not want to ruin her day, but I was no longer willing to be the person they erased, and I wanted her to understand that. She said my name in a way that made me remember the girl who ran through the house in stocking feet. Then she caught herself and asked if I would at least keep this to myself for the sake of appearances. I told her I would think about what was fair. When the call ended, I set the phone on the desk, and for a moment I let the room be still. A line of light slid across the floor as a cloud moved past the sun. Somewhere in the building, a door closed softly. I heard my mother's hand on my shoulder from a lifetime ago, a light pat that felt like a promise and a dismissal at the same time. And I said aloud, not for anyone else, but for me, this is not revenge, it is respect. I want. The phone began again, once, twice then, without pause, a steady river of calls and messages. Erin, then Richard, then Vanessa, again numbers I knew, and numbers I did not, each one a pull back into the noise. I watched the screen fill, then I pressed mute and turned the phone face down. The quiet that followed felt like a clear space made just for me. It lasted exactly long enough for 3 knocks to land on my door, firm and measured. I opened it, and my father stood there, the same steady look he had worn at every board meeting, the same careful jaw, the same weight that filled a room. He did not wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, and the air seemed to pull tight. He said he had heard some wild claims, and hoped I would say they were not true. I told him they were true, and that if he wanted to talk about family, he could start by saying my name without looking past me. He ignored that and spoke of the Ashworths, of the guests, of the need to avoid embarrassment. He said the word honour as if he could stack it between us like a wall. He told me I must keep quiet, that I must stay away from the wedding, that I must not make a spectacle of myself, and he said it in that flat way of his that makes command sound like reason. I let him finish. Then I asked him gently, but without giving an inch, if he had come to my door to erase me again. The colour rose in his face. He said I was being dramatic, that I was thinking only of myself, that I did not understand the consequences of my actions. I took a breath and felt a calm I had not felt in years settle into my spine. I told him I understood consequences very well, that I had lived with them my whole life, and that I would not disappear to protect a story that left me out. I told him I had no wish to ruin Erin's day, that the ceremony would go on, that I would sit where I was placed and keep the peace. But I would not deny what was true, not to please anyone and not to hide. He looked at me as if I had become someone he did not know. Then he nodded once and said we would speak again, and he left without looking back. I stood in the doorway and watched the hall breathe him out. My heart was steady. The ground felt steady too. I closed the door, lifted the phone, saw the missed calls stacked in a red tower, and put it back down without a word. Tomorrow they would see me not because I shouted, but because the truth was standing and would not move. That thought stayed with me through the night, steady as breath. Yet I also knew my father and brother well enough to understand that they would not let the matter rest. They never had. If power slipped from their grip, they would tighten their fists until something cracked. I learned long ago to listen for the quiet, aftershocks, the signals that plans were being made behind closed doors. I did not need to be in the room to know when a family meeting was taking place. The signs were always the same: Richard's sudden silence on calls, Mark's absence from the usual circles Erin pulled tighter between them. I pictured them gathered in my father's study, the heavy curtains drawn the light low, the air thick with smoke and judgment. Richard would pour a drink first because he liked to begin with ritual. He would speak of family honour, of appearances, of how I had made a scene and threatened the name he had built. He would not speak of me as a daughter, only as a problem to be solved. I could almost hear his voice low and certain, telling them I must not be allowed to turn the wedding into my stage. Mark would be next. He had always been eager to prove himself sharper, though his sharpness was only ever aimed at me. I could see him leaning forward with that smug half-smile, suggesting that if I showed my face at the wedding, they could cut the power, let the ballroom fall into chaos, and then whisper that the failure was mine. He would say, people expected little from me anyway, so a technical mishap tied to my name would only confirm what they already believed. I could hear the satisfaction in his tone as he imagined me blamed in front of everyone. Erin would shrink at that, I was sure. She had called me in anger, but beneath her words, I had heard a crack of doubt. She had never been cruel in the same way as Mark. I imagined her voice softer now, saying she only wanted peace, saying I was still her sister. But my father would not allow softness. He would press her down with words about weakness, about duty, about loyalty to the family. Mark would laugh and mock me, calling me a guest in my own house, and Erin, caught between them, would lower her eyes and fall silent. That silence had been the story of her life as it had once been mine. I leaned against the window of my apartment and let the picture play out in my mind. I was not in the room, but I knew it, as if I was seated in the corner, watching them circle their plan. Richard would end it the way he ended every serious talk, with a toast. He would raise his glass, declare it was for honour, for family, for appearances, and Mark would smirk as if victory were already his. Erin would not lift her glass, not all the way, but she would not stop them either. I knew this as surely as I knew the city lights would still burn by morning. The thought did not frighten me, though perhaps it should have. Instead, it hardened the resolve already forming in me. I had lived my life anticipating their schemes, cleaning the messes they left, carrying the weight of their choices. But this time was different. This time, the house they plotted to destroy belonged to me. I whispered it aloud, as if reminding the night itself. Grandview Manor is mine, and if they cut the power, if they tried to frame me, they would find that I had already built safeguards. I would not walk blind into their trap. I would be ready. What stung most was not the plan itself, but the truth behind it. My father could still look at me and see only a threat to be silenced. My brother could still spend his energy not building, but destroying what was mine. And my sister, torn between them, could still be pressed into silence rather than stepping toward me. It was the same play repeated again and again, but now the stage was different, and so was I. I would not stop them from scheming. That was their nature, but I would not let them succeed. I placed my hand flat against the glass, feeling the cool surface steady me. Tomorrow, they would play their game, and tomorrow I would play mine. The difference was that I had learned patience, and I had learned how to turn their weapons back upon them. I would not let anger blind me. I would let the truth stand visible, immovable. And when the lights flickered, if they dared to make them flicker, the only ones left in the dark would be them. I repeated that promise to myself as the car slowed at the gates of Grand View and the stone pillars came into view soft against the morning light. The lawns trimmed clean, the old white facade steady and calm, like a breath held and released. I stepped out and felt the quiet pride I do not show to anyone, the kind that lives under the ribs when you see something you built, standing as it should. Guests were already arriving in small clusters, voices low and bright, the kind of talk that floats above nerves on a wedding day, and I walked among them with an easy smile and a measured step. A woman in a navy dress and pearl studs, elegant enough to belong, simple enough to go unnoticed. Inside the vestibule, Anna was waiting, her posture straight, her eyes warm in the careful way of someone who holds a secret without ever speaking it. "Mrs. Marlowe," she said softly, and the way she said it told me we were both on the same page. "Welcome. Everything is as you asked." "Thank you," I said, and I leaned just close enough for her to hear the rest. "Today I am a family friend, not the owner. If anyone asks, that is what they should hear." She nodded once, a small smile rising and settling, and in that little exchange I felt the weight of trust we had built over these months, the kind of trust that does not need more than a few words to stand. We moved as if we were only passing the time, but each step had a purpose. I asked her to send a quiet note to the team on the terrace to test the backup power one more time, and to have someone stand by in case the main line faltered. Not because I believed in trouble for its own sake, but because trouble had been promised by the people who called themselves my family. She understood without me saying more, and within a minute, a staff member drifted toward the side corridor, easy and unremarkable, while Anna told me the garden chairs had been set in clean arcs, and the sound check had gone well. We walked through the lobby, where arrangements waited to be carried out, and I let my hand brush the polished rail in a way that looked like a casual touch, though I was really feeling the steady strength of the wood, as if the building itself could answer me. "Yes, we are ready." In the ballroom, the chandeliers were already glowing at half-light tablecloths, smooth glassware, aligned like a quiet chorus, and for a moment I let the room speak to me as a host, even though I stood in it as a guest. Vanessa approached from the far side, her smile pulled tight, clipboard pressed to her side as if it could keep her steady. She thanked me in a low rush for my patience, for my kindness, for not throwing the day into chaos, and I told her in a tone meant for her ears alone that I was not here to hurt anyone, least of all my sister, and that the best help she could give me was to keep the timeline clean and the speeches short. She nodded with a small laugh that held more relief than humour, and promised to do exactly that. When she slipped away, I took in the small movements that make a venue breathe, the staff in black, moving like a quiet tide, the sound crew speaking softly, the florist lifting a final bloom into place. "I am a family friend," I reminded myself, and I let that simple line carry me forward. Outside the garden waited white chairs facing the arbour, a light wind passing through the leaves so gently it looked like blessing. I stood under the arch for one heartbeat and lifted my eyes to the square of sky above, and I thought of Erin, how she had sounded last night when the anger ran out and the fear showed itself, and I wished for her a day that felt safe, not staged. A hush moved through the path behind me, and when I turned, I saw Richard and Mark at the far edge of the terrace, heads bent as if sharing a private joke, eyes skimming the crowd with the hunger of men who need to know they are still in charge. Richard saw me first and looked away the next second, as if the sight of me pulled something sharp through his chest. Mark held my gaze, a small smile on his mouth that did not reach his eyes, and I gave him nothing back. Not anger, not fear, not even a lift of the chin. I simply let him see me, standing in my place without apology. Anna returned with a quiet update, saying the test had gone clean and a second check would happen before the first dance, and that our person by the panel would remain there until the end of the night, visible to no one but ready to act in a breath. I thanked her and asked her to take a short walk with me around the side terrace, because it helped put eyes on the corners where small things can go wrong. And we passed the door that leads to the service corridor, and I asked if the radio channel set for emergencies had been kept clear, only one voice at a time, no chatter. She said yes, and described how the team would hand off if they needed to adjust lines to keep the music steady, and the room lit, and I felt the knot in my chest loosen by a fraction. This was not fear, I told myself, it was readiness. And readiness is a kind of love when the day belongs to someone you once held in your arms and told stories to until she slept. As guests began to flow more quickly toward the garden, I took my seat where Anna had arranged it third row by the aisle, the place for a friend who mattered but did not ask for notice. People settled around me with the warm rustle of fabric and the soft chime of bracelets and watches, and I let their talk move past my shoulders like a harmless stream. From here I could see the path the bride would take, the space where she would pause and draw a breath, and I closed my eyes for one small second and wished her a clean step, a steady hand, a heart that stayed soft. When I opened them, the sun had shifted a little, and in the corner of the terrace I saw Mark signal to someone who looked quickly away. It was a tiny thing gone in a blink, but I felt the air tighten the way air does before a summer storm, and I pressed my palms together to keep my centre still. Let them play their game, I whispered inside my own mind. This house answers to me. I smoothed my dress, nodded to the usher who glanced my way, and fixed my attention on the aisle where the day was about to begin. I had done what I could. The rest would be timing and truth. I kept that thought steady as I sat in the third row by the aisle, hands folded over my clutch, breathing with the soft rise and fall of the room. Guests drifted to their seats in small waves, the murmur of kind voices and careful compliments washing past me. The garden held its breath, as gardens do before something important begins, and for a moment I let the calm settle into my shoulders. Then I saw Erin break away from her bridesmaids, moving toward me with the small, quick steps of someone who wishes to be invisible and cannot be. She stopped a pace from my chair, bouquet held a little too tight, the ribbon pressing a line into her fingers. "You came," she said, and her voice wavered on the last word, not from anger now, but from something softer. I rose and faced her. "I am here," I said, and I let the words land simply without edge. For a breath, she looked like the girl who used to knock on my door after a storm. Hair loose, eyes wide, asking if I would sit with her until the thunder passed. "I am sorry," she said then, the words low and halting. "I was wrong to push you away. I thought I was protecting the day, but I was protecting the story they told me to repeat." Her eyes shone and she looked down, as if the weight of the bouquet had grown. I felt my guard loosen by a small inch, enough to let her see I heard her. I told her the wedding would be beautiful, that I wanted that for her and that I would not ruin it. I also told her I would not vanish to make anyone else comfortable. She nodded a quick nod that said she knew the price I had paid to speak so calmly now. "Thank you," she whispered, and for a moment she reached as if to take my hand, then pulled back with a small sorry smile, the way a child remembers the rules of a stage. "Go," I said softly. "They will be looking for you." She turned away, and I watched her gather herself back into the place the day had given her. When I sat again, the edge of my vision caught movement at the terrace steps. Richard had entered, shoulders, squared mouth, set the room, bending around him the way rooms often did. His gaze swept over the guests, measuring, claiming, and then it reached me. For a beat, he held as if a thought had struck clean through him, and then he looked away too quickly, fixing on a distant table card. It was a small thing, but I felt it. The ground under him was not as certain as it used to be. I did not smile. I did not need to. I only let the truth sit between us, quiet as a stone. I felt eyes on me from another corner, and found Mark half in shadow near the service path, tie-straight jaw, set a look that was not curiosity and not welcome. He raised his glass a fraction without warmth, the kind of gesture that says, "I see you and I am not pleased," and I gave him nothing back, no challenge, no invitation, just a steady gaze that said I was not moving. The music swelled and softened as the sound team made final adjustments. A child somewhere in the back laughed and was hushed, then laughed again, because that is what children do. I let all of it pass through me, the ordinary and the sharp, and I rested my hand on the clutch to keep it still. The phone inside it buzzed once, then again. I lifted the flap just enough to see the screen. A message from a number I did not know. "They see you now, but do you see them?" I read it twice then, a third time, feeling the thin chill that carries warning without proof. I closed the flap slow and calm and let the phone settle against my palm. I did not look around to guess where it came from. I have learned that staring into a crowd gives fear too much to drink. Instead, I lifted my head and took in the room as a whole, the faces open and expectant, the door to the terrace standing wide, the staff in their places, Anna a quiet presence near the side aisle, Vanessa moving like a small current through the centre of the space. Someone was watching, yes. Someone had always been watching. The question was not if, but to what end. I tasted a familiar mix of hope and caution, and I chose to keep both. I glanced towards the far aisle and saw Erin again, now framed by her bridesmaids. She caught my eye, and for a heartbeat she smiled, not the practiced smile of a bride, but the small, grateful one that belongs to the private part of a person. I held that look and let it steady me. Then I felt Richard's presence without needing to see him. He had drawn closer to the front, close enough that he could pretend not to notice me, and still notice me. His jaw worked once, twice, as if a word had stuck there. He turned away, spoke to a guest, laughed at something that was not funny, and I understood he was working to hold his place. The cracks had begun, not loud cracks, but hairline lines that widen with time and pressure. Mark spoke to a man I did not know too, close too quiet, his eyes sliding past me every few sentences, and each time they did, I felt the old heat rise in my chest and then pass. Not today, I told that heat. Not now. The music shifted to the gentle notes that mean it is time, and the room answered by growing still. I straightened my back, set my feet, and let my breath go out slow. Erin's apology sat in one hand of my heart. The anonymous warning sat in the other. Between them, a narrow bridge of calm, the only place I could stand. I thought of the words I had told myself when I arrived. I am a family friend, not the owner. I thought of the other words beneath that polite mask. This house answers to me. Both truths could live in one body if I walked carefully. I pressed my palms together, once as if in prayer, and released them. I would carry hope for my sister. I would carry watchfulness for myself. And if someone wished me blind today, they would find my eyes were open. The aisle cleared. A hush settled that felt like a blessing and a warning at the same time. I kept my gaze forward and waited for the first step that would begin the rest of the day. The ceremony moved like a quiet tide, vows spoken with care, promises laid down in the open air, and when Erin and Bradley kissed the garden, lifted in relief. Soft applause rising and falling like a breath. I let myself feel that small grace, then followed the stream of guests into the ballroom, where the light rested warmer, where tables shone, and the band held a gentle line ready to climb. I took my place near the edge of the room, close enough to see everything, far enough to keep my own counsel. Plates were served toasts, whispered, and the murmur grew easy. Then Richard stood with a glass in his hand, the way he has always stood when he wants the whole room, and the room gave itself to him, because rooms have been trained to do that. He spoke of family and tradition, of a daughter stepping into a new life, of the pride a father carries when he looks across a room and sees his work made visible in a child. And he said the word honour so smoothly it might have been a prayer. I felt the old ache stir, the one that knows how much of this is performance and how much is love, and then I felt something steadier press its hand against that ache and still it. I did not plan to take the room from him. I planned only to claim my place in it. I rose when he paused to breathe, not rushed, not dramatic, only sure, and I stepped toward the small open space between the tables and the band, and for a heartbeat, the sound softened around me. I spoke without raising my voice, because truth does not need to shout. If tonight is about love and gratitude, I said, then let me add one simple truth, so we all stand on the same ground. All of Grandview Manor belongs to me. The words did not echo. They landed and stayed. A fork stopped halfway to a mouth. A laugh broke and did not finish. I saw the recognition ripple across faces in waves, disbelief first, then surprise, then the quick glance to a neighbour, as if to check whether they had heard what I had said. Richard stared at me, the colour draining and then returning as if he could push it back into place by force. Mark went pale in a way I had not seen since we were young, and he heard a teacher say my name with praise. Erin pressed her fingers to her mouth. Eyes wet a look that was apology and pride at the same time. I let the silence hold for a count, then I went on steady as breath. I chose to attend as a guest, I said, because this day belongs to Erin and Bradley, not to me, and because I want their beginning to be simple. But I will not be erased from my own house. If anyone doubts what I have said, the records are public and easy to find. I felt the room lean toward me, and I did not give them more than they needed. Mark found his voice, first the way he always does, when he thinks the truth can be smudged if he speaks quickly enough. He said I was mistaken, that perhaps I meant I had a hand in operations, that surely I did not mean ownership. I looked at him and answered in the same even tone. I mean, ownership. You may check the county records if you wish. There was a small rustle then, the kind that means people are already thinking of who they know, who can confirm it by morning. Richard lifted his glass as if to reclaim the moment, then set it down, because there was nothing he could say that would not sound small. I did not gloat. I did not list the years they called me a disappointment, the deals I carried on my back, so someone else could bow at the end. I raised my glass toward Erin and Bradley and said this simple and clear. This house is yours tonight, and I wish you joy within its walls. And to those who wondered who keeps these walls standing, now you know. The bandleader, bless him, understood what needed to happen and touched two quiet notes that rolled like calm across the floor. Someone began to clap awkward at first, then braver, and the sound grew into something that felt clean. Vanessa exhaled with her hands pressed to her clipboard, as if I had lifted a weight from her chest. Anna watched me from near the side aisle, her eyes steady a small nod that said, "Good, now we can do the work we came to do." I saw Mark's jaw tighten, a storm gathering behind his eyes. He leaned toward a man I did not know and spoke without smiling. I saw Richard sit down as if the chair had pulled him there. His gaze caught on a point just past me, a place where his version of the story used to stand. Erin stepped away from the head table and came close enough for me to read the apology in her face, then stopped because this was not the moment to make a scene about the past, and I gave her a soft smile that said, I understood. My hands did not shake. My breath did not race. The years of being spoken over fell quiet inside me. I set my glass down, turned to the band, and said, "Please keep playing." The song lifted, the room remembered the reason we were all there, and the current of the night moved forward again. I returned to my place at the edge and felt the floor hold me as if it had been waiting for my weight, and perhaps it had. In that moment, I did not think of victory. I thought of balance. I thought of a young woman who had carried too much and finally set half of it down. If anyone wished to call what I had done a show, they were free to try, but those who had listened closely knew it was only a claim, a clear line drawn where a line had been missing. I watched Erin lay her head on Bradley's shoulder and sway, the two of them, small and brave, in a room that had just learned a new truth, and I let the music wash away the last of the noise in my head. The house was standing, I was standing, and the night for now belonged to joy. The band lifted into a bright song. Erin and Bradley moved through their first dance with the sweet focus of new promise, and the guests circled them with soft smiles and raised glasses. I let myself exhale just once a small breath of ease. Then the chandeliers blinked. It was only a thin flicker, at first the kind that makes people glance up and then return to their talk, but a heartbeat later, they dimmed, hard brightened too fast, and fell to a low glow that made the room hold still. The music faltered and then cut a bow skidding across a string with a small cry, and the ballroom filled with the hush that follows a sudden stop. Someone near the head table said it was nothing. Someone else laughed the wrong kind of laugh, and I felt the hairline crack of fear move through the crowd, like a ripple in glass. I did not move my feet. I let the quiet pass through me, then I turned my head just enough to see Anna already at my side. Her voice low and steady relay, tripped, not an accident. The words sat clean in my ear. I nodded once. The room began to swell with the sounds people make when they do not know what happens next. Chairs shifting forks set down, a child asking a question out loud, and in that small rise of noise, Mark stepped into the open space as if the floor had been cleared for him. He lifted his hands like a man who wishes to calm a crowd, and said in a voice meant to carry that this was very unfortunate, that sometimes when ownership changes hands, the small details are missed, and that perhaps certain shortcuts had been taken. He let the words drift in my direction without saying my name. I watched his eyes and understood he was not done. Two men near the service corridor began to move, in holding a small metal box and a length of scraped wire, as if they had found it. One of them looked around as though waiting for permission to be shocked. Mark said he had asked the staff earlier about a loose line, and that he had been told the owner preferred to handle things quietly. He was building a story in plain sight when he had planned before the first light flickered. For a moment, the old urge rose in me, the one that wants to call a lie at the top of its lungs, but I pressed it down and lifted my hand slightly, where only Anna could see it. Her radio clicked once the faintest sound, and then she told me in a tone that held a promise that the backup could be brought in if I wished. 10 seconds, she said. I met her eyes and gave the smallest nod. She turned away without haste, as if stepping aside to make room for a guest, and the air held its breath. I let the silence sit 1 second longer, not to punish the room, but to remind it that panic was a choice we would not make. Then, from somewhere deep in the bones of the building, a soft hum answered, and with it a steady surge of light climbed the stems of the chandeliers, bead by bead, until the room stood bright again. The bandleader raised his bow in a clean arc, caught the thread of the melody, and sent it over the floor with the kind of grace that makes people believe nothing serious had happened at all. The guests exhaled in one warm wave, and then applauded a sound of relief that had gratitude inside it. Vanessa pressed a hand to her chest and closed her eyes for a second, then moved like a fast minute through her team, whispering instructions that kept the timeline intact. I did not look at Mark until the clapping began to fall away. When I did, I saw it on his face, the quick wash of anger that comes when a plan finds no place to root. He still held the momentary props his men had tried to bring to the stage, the little box, the scraped wire, and now they looked foolish in his hands. He tried to rally with a thin smile, saying lightly that it was good when a venue had responsive support, that perhaps the new owner had learned from a stumble. I answered him in a voice the room could hear, calm, even free of heat. This house protects its guests always. That is the only story that belongs here. He opened his mouth to press, then thought better, because pressing now would only make him smaller. Richard sat with his jaw set and his eyes unfixed, as if the script he had trusted had been smudged beyond use. Erin looked from the lights to me and back again, a hand to her throat, and in that look I saw gratitude 2 shades deeper than the one she'd given me in the garden. Anna returned to my side and spoke under her breath. The panel is manned. Main line checked, no more surprises unless someone forces one. I thanked her and let my shoulders fall back into their natural place. Around us, the guests picked up their glasses. The servers found their rhythm. The laughter returned like a careful guest who chooses the right door. The fear that had risen now softened into a story these people would tell later, and smile. A flicker, yes, but then a steady hand. I did not claim credit. I did not need to. A woman at the next table leaned toward me and said she was glad someone knew what to do, and I nodded with the kind of smile that does not ask for more. My phone buzzed once in the clutch, a short pulse that felt like a finger tapping my attention. I did not take it out. There would be time for warnings and whispers later. Right now, the band was alive. Erin was safe in her circle of light, and the night belonged to the promise we had all come to honour. I gave one more small signal to Anna and watched her ghost pass the edge of the room, a quiet guardian moving through her own house with confidence. The chandeliers shone clean and steady, the floor held, and the story Mark had tried to write had no ink left. I stood near the terrace doors and let the music settle around me like a soft coat, the band easing the room back into warmth, laughter returning in careful threads, and then I felt the change in the air that happens when someone steps close with a purpose. My father stood beside me, not in the centre of a circle, for once not holding a glass. High, just a man who had run out of lines he trusted. He said my name with none of the thunder he usually carried, and he asked if I would step outside for a minute. I nodded and followed him onto the terrace, where the lanterns cast a low light, where the night held the garden and the sounds of the party fell to a hush. He leaned his hands against the stone rail, as if he needed help holding himself up, and for a while he said nothing. When he did speak, his voice was flatter than I had ever heard it, a voice that had finally put down its armour. He said he was sorry. He said he had failed me as a father. He said he had let Mark take bows for work that was not his, that he had often praised the wrong child, that he had chosen what was easy over what was true. I listened and kept my eyes on the garden, because I could not hold his face and those words at the same time. The apology moved through me like water, finding places I thought had already turned to stone. He went on. He said there were things he had done to protect the family name, decisions I would not like, and then he told me the one that took the breath from my chest. He had known about money. Mark moved years ago, money that did not belong to him, and he had covered it, sealed it, told himself it was for honour, and for the business and for the future, and he had done it knowing the cost would land on me because it always had. I turned and looked at him then. The man who had taught me to solve problems by pushing them hard until they moved stood there with the truth on his mouth, and I felt anger and grief rise in the same wave. I asked him the only question that mattered. Why was I the one you chose to lose? He rubbed his brow as if he could push back time, and he said the sentence I had always feared. Because I thought you would marry and your name would change and Mark would carry the firm. I thought that was the order of things. He said he had told himself it was not personal, that it was practical, that he was doing what any head of a family would do. But he knew it was personal, and he knew it every time he looked away from me when I spoke. The night pressed in. I let the truth stand between us. Then I told him what it had felt like to be the child at the table, whose words never landed the woman in the conference room whose work was taken, the sister erased from a day meant for love. I told him I had built a life where my voice could not be taken from me without a fight, and I had done it with the tools I learned in his house, only I used them to make space, not to close doors. I did not raise my voice. I did not list every ache. I told him I heard his apology, but apologies do not repair the flaw alone. He nodded more to himself than to me, and said he wanted to do better, to begin again to talk as equals after tonight. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed once in the clutch, a short sound that felt urgent in the quiet air. I opened it just enough to see the screen. They will come to you now, but not all come with love. No name, no signal of who had sent it, only that plain warning. I slid the phone away and did not change my face because I did not want to hand him my fear. Someone was watching, yes. Someone had always been watching. The message only told me they were ready to step closer. My father asked what I needed from him. His voice did not land as a demand. It landed like a hand held out that might shake if I looked too closely. I told him I needed proof that the apology could stand up. I needed him to stop hiding Mark's damage as if it were weather that would pass. I needed him to put action where the words were, to stop choosing silence, because it made the room easier. I told him that respect is not a gift you wrap in regret. It is a series of steps you take and keep taking. He said he understood. I did not say I believed him. I said I would wait and see. We stood a few feet apart like people who had just survived a storm and were not yet sure what the ground would be in the morning. He looked older at the edges and younger at the centre, as if telling the truth had taken years from his mouth and given them to his eyes. He reached as if to touch my shoulder, then stopped and let his hand fall. He said he was proud of me. He said he had not wanted to be, but he was. I let the words come and rest, and I did not let them fix more than they could. From inside, the next song rose warm and bright, and the noise of the party reached us like a gentle tide. He asked if we could walk back in together. I told him he should go first. He hesitated, then nodded, understanding what I had asked for without me saying it. He went through the doors and disappeared into the light. I stayed where I was and took one long breath, felt the warning circle me with its quiet ring, and then I lifted my head and followed at my own pace. My sister would need steady ground. My brother would look for a way back to the centre. My father would have to prove that he could stand without lies. And I, who had kept this house standing tonight, would keep it standing still on terms that did not erase me. I walked back into the ballroom with that thought steady in my chest. The chandeliers glowed clean, the music had smoothed over the fear of the blackout, and laughter was returning in careful steps. But I saw him, Mark, waiting near the far wall. His smile was stretched too thin, his eyes already fixed on me. He moved forward quickly, louder than he needed to be. He spoke about family honour, about how unfortunate it was that I had chosen this night to put myself in the spotlight. He said it softly, as if concerned, but sharp enough to draw blood. The guests around us, stilled forks, set down heads tilting in quiet attention. I did not flinch. I told him if he had something to say, he should say it plainly. The night belonged to the bride and groom, not to whispers dressed as warnings. He gave a small laugh and leaned into his story. He spoke of irregularities from past deals, money that had shifted as though he meant to turn the crowd's eyes on me. He was about to name me as the cause. That was his mistake. I slipped a folder from my clutch, thin but heavy with truth. I opened it carefully so the room felt the weight of what I held. I turned the first page toward him. These are transfers from the Patterson deal, I said, voice, even, dates, amounts, and accounts that do not belong to the firm. The colour drained from his face, slow and certain. I flipped another page, and here are confirmations from the bank. The accounts tie back to a company you registered under a false name. The air thinned. A few guests leaned forward, whispering. Erin stood frozen near the head table, her hands clasped her face, pale. And then I felt it my father's presence at my back. Richard had drawn closer without a word, and now he stood behind me, his breath heavy, one hand on the chair beside him, as if bracing for a fall. Mark's jaw tightened. He said I had always been clever, that I could have forged the papers, that perhaps in my hunger to prove myself I had crossed a line. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, the bank officer who signed these will take a call right now if anyone wishes. The auditors will confirm the rest. Richard's voice cracked in for the first time, asking for the date of the first transfer. I gave it to him. His shoulders sagged. He knew. Mark turned from him to me, desperation carving his face. His voice dropped to a hiss, meant for me, but loud enough for the circle around us. If you expose this, I'll take us all down. I'll drag every scandal, every hidden deal into the light. I'll burn the family name to ash if I have to. I held his gaze steady as stone. Truth saves the honest. Lies only protect the guilty. If there are closets to clean, then clean them. But don't hold this room hostage with your threats. A murmur spread, not scandalous this time, but relieved like fresh air in a shut room. People had heard enough lies. Richard whispered, enough. He didn't defend Mark. He didn't defend himself. Just that one word, heavy as an ending. Erin stepped closer, her voice trembling but clear. My sister kept this night whole, she said. You tried to break it. Everyone here knows the difference. Mark's anger flickered, but there was nothing left for him to grab. His hands clenched around air, his mouth twisting without words. I closed the folder, letting it hang at my side. The rest of this will be handled where it should be, I said to the room in daylight with auditors and counsel. Tonight belongs to Erin and Bradley, not to secrets and shame. Erin's eyes filled. She nodded once, unable to speak, but the gratitude was written clear. The band, quick to read the air, lifted a softer tune, weaving sound back into the silence. People stepped away, their circle dissolving conversations, murmuring back to life. But they would not forget. Not tonight. Richard's eyes lingered on me, not as they once did, not as if I were the problem child. He looked at me as if he had finally seen the person standing in front of him. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say sorry. He only let the silence rest between us, and for the first time it didn't erase me. It made space. I breathed deep, the folder warm in my hand. The fight was not finished, but the truth was out, and the lies no longer belonged to me. I stepped back toward the edge of the ballroom, the music and chatter beginning to rise again, but I no longer cared about the noise around me. My mind was already moving forward. I pulled my phone from my clutch and opened a draft, fingers steady though my heart still carried the weight of the confrontation. The subject line was simple terms. No more late-night arguments in family offices, no more broken promises whispered in dining rooms. This time it would be written, binding and final. I began with what mattered most. Any cooperation between Henderson Financial and Marlowe Holdings would only happen under formal contracts. No handshakes, no favours, no talk of family duty. Next, Mark would be excluded from every joint venture effective immediately. His hands had poisoned too many deals, and the cost of his greed would not land on my shoulders again. Then the condition that would cut deepest. An independent audit of Henderson Financial. No excuses, no delays. If they refused, I would continue my bid to buy their headquarters outright. The offer was already on the table. Their landlord had listened, and I knew time was on my side. I read it over once more, then kept the draft open in my hand, waiting for the right moment to send. Behind me, I felt a soft presence hesitant. It was Erin. She looked pale, her dress heavy now instead of light. Her eyes rimmed red, as if she had seen her own reflection and not recognized it. She asked if we could step aside. I nodded, and we moved toward the far corner, near the terrace doors where the air was cooler. She lowered her voice almost a whisper. She said she had overheard Bradley's parents earlier speaking in low tones about the wedding, about how the Ashworth family expected this marriage to lock in a financial partnership with the Hendersons. She swallowed hard, admitting she suddenly felt less like a bride and more like a piece on a board moved to protect someone else's empire. I listened quietly. Then I told her that she was not wrong. Families like ours did not just trade in affection. They traded in power. And sometimes people we trusted used our lives as bargaining chips. Her eyes filled with tears. She asked if I had known. I said no, not until tonight, but it explained why Bradley's family had been so eager, why father had praised the match so strongly. Erin shook her head, as if trying to loosen the weight of it. She said she had believed she was finally being celebrated for who she was, and now she wondered if she had only been useful for what she could bring. I placed a hand on her arm and told her this was exactly why I had written my terms. Because no woman should be left at the mercy of shifting promises, no matter how pretty they sounded. Boundaries kept us from being used. Contracts gave us room to breathe. Erin nodded, though her tears slipped free. She said she was proud of me, ashamed it had taken so long to say it. I told her she didn't owe me pride. What she owed herself was the courage to stop living as someone else's pawn. I turned back to my phone, then the draft still open. I pressed send. The message left with a soft click, quiet and final. There was no way to recall it now, no way for them to pretend they hadn't read it. They would either meet me as an equal or lose the only chance they had to stand beside me at all. A strange calm filled me as I slipped the phone away. For the first time, the Hendersons could not erase me with words. They would have to face me in daylight on paper under law. That thought gave me peace, even as I knew the war was far from over. Erin stood beside me, her eyes on the crowd that still danced and laughed, unaware of the cracks opening beneath their hosts. She whispered that she was afraid of what was coming. I told her fear was natural, but silence was worse. And then I smiled, faint but certain, because now the ground was mine. The ballroom emptied slowly through the night, the music fading into softer notes until only staff remained folding linens and sweeping glitter from the floor. I slipped away quietly, walking past the terrace and down toward the water's edge. Dawn was just breaking, pale light spreading across the lake. I stood there with the cool air brushing against my face, the sky slowly shifting from grey to gold. For the first time in years, I felt something settle inside me. They had finally seen me, not because I begged, not because I fought for scraps, but because the empire I built left them no choice. Respect was mine, and it did not need their permission. I heard footsteps behind me softer than the wind. When I turned, my mother was there. Margaret. She looked smaller than I remembered, wrapped in a shawl, her hair pulled back as if the night had worn her down. She stopped a few steps away, her eyes searching mine before she spoke. She said she was sorry for all the years of silence, sorry for standing by, while Richard praised Mark and dismissed me. She told me something I had already suspected, but needed to hear. She had been the one sending the messages. She had wanted me to know I was not as alone as I felt, even if she did not have the courage to say it out loud until now. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, her voice trembled. She said she could not undo the harm of her silence, but She wanted to do one thing right before it was too late. If I chose to keep building what I had started to run my empire without the shadows of their old games, she would stand with me. She reached for my hand, then, hesitant, I let her take it. For years, I had resented her quiet, her refusal to see me. But in that moment, I saw not just a mother who had failed me, but a woman who had lived too long under a man's shadow. I told her it wasn't too late, not if she was willing to stand now. She nodded, tears filling her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you." The sky brightened as we stood together. She finally released my hand and walked back toward the manor, leaving me with the still water and the soft light of morning. My phone buzzed once, but when I opened it, the messages had stopped. No more anonymous warnings. My mother had chosen to speak in person. Across the city, I knew another scene was unfolding. Mark would not sleep after tonight. I could picture him in his apartment, staring out at the skyline, with rage twisting in his chest. I could hear his voice, low and bitter, telling someone on the other end of the line that this wasn't over, that round 2 was already beginning. And I knew him well enough to believe it. But I also knew myself. I slipped the phone back into my clutch and looked at the horizon. The sun had cleared the line of water gold spilling across the surface. For the first time, I did not feel like a daughter fighting for scraps. I felt like the woman who held the pen who would decide the terms of what came next. I whispered into the quiet air that I was ready. Ready for whatever Mark had planned. Ready for whatever storms might rise. I had been underestimated all my life, and tonight proved that was their greatest mistake.